Hey there, welcome back. I hope you have your favorite drink handy and you are ready to settle in, because I have 3 unique stories for you tonight. The last one kept me awake for hours after I finished writing it, so you might want to turn the lights down low for this one. Marcus always had a way of making theft feel like a bold business strategy. He sat across from me in that polished glass office, his silk tie perfectly knotted, talking about market restructuring and efficiency. He thought he was being generous by offering me a pittance of a severance package while taking my company, the one I had built in my basement while he was still sleeping until noon. I nodded through the whole meeting, keeping my face as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. He had no idea that I had spent the last 90 days monitoring every digital footprint he left. He was arrogant, and that arrogance was his blind spot. He lived for high-stakes gambling and expensive dinners that he put on the company credit card, assuming the books would never be audited because he was the one in charge of the auditors. What he didn't realize was that I had maintained a ghost server for years, one that mirrored every transaction and flagged every personal withdrawal as a felony-level discrepancy. As he slid the final contract across the mahogany desk, he told me it was just business and that I should not take it personally. I told him I understood perfectly. I spent the next week watching from my living room window as he celebrated his takeover. He bought a new car, booked a trip to the coast, and started bragging to our mutual friends about how he had single-handedly saved the firm from my incompetence. On the day he went to finalize the big merger, he walked into the lobby and found 4 men in dark suits waiting for him. They were not from the bank. They were from the Financial Crimes Division. I sat in a small cafe across the street, sipping a lukewarm coffee, and watched as they led him out in handcuffs. The beauty of it was not just the arrest, but the fact that he was so convinced of his own brilliance that he had left a perfect paper trail of fraud that I had conveniently gift-wrapped for the authorities. When the police looked through the files, they found that every penny he had siphoned had been documented by my automated system months ago. He looked up at my window as they pushed him into the back of the cruiser. I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast. He had his company all right, but it was now a shell of a business tied to a federal investigation that would keep him busy for at least a decade. The best part was knowing that while he was busy explaining his creative accounting to a judge, I was already home, starting the design for my next venture, completely debt-free and under the radar. People say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I prefer to think of it as a clean, efficient closing of an account. I bought the Victorian fixer-upper because the price was too good to be true, and in hindsight, that should have been the first warning sign. It was a beautiful place with original molding and a yard that felt like a private forest. But the nights were different. The hum started on my second week, right around the time I finished stripping the wallpaper in the master bedroom. It sounded like a massive hive of bees located somewhere behind the drywall, or perhaps a heavy industrial fan struggling to turn. I checked the vents, the insulation, and the pipes, but the house remained silent during the daylight hours. My neighbors, an elderly couple who had lived next door since the 1960s, would only look down at their shoes whenever I asked if the previous owners had mentioned any structural issues. I spent a month documenting the sound, recording the frequencies on my phone and playing them back, searching for a pattern. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, but accelerated and cold. One rainy Tuesday, I decided to pull up the floorboards in the attic directly above where the sound seemed to originate. I expected to find a forgotten piece of machinery or perhaps a faulty wiring harness. Instead, I found a lead-lined box tucked between the joists, bolted to the concrete foundation of the chimney. It wasn't humming anymore. It was silent, heavy, and covered in a thick layer of dust that looked undisturbed for decades. I managed to pry the lid open with a crowbar, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes, each labeled with a date and a name. I picked one up, my fingers trembling. The date was from 1984. I took it downstairs to an old player I kept in the den. I pressed play, expecting static or maybe some long-lost music. What I heard was my own voice. It was me describing the exact layout of the house and the specific anxiety I felt about the humming dated yesterday. I sat in the dark for a long time, the tape loop finishing and clicking off. Then the house began to hum again. but this time it was coming from the basement, and it sounded exactly like the sound of someone walking up the wooden stairs. I didn't reach for the light. I realized then that the house wasn't just a place to live. It was a recording device, and I was merely the latest voice to be catalogued in its memory. Every step I took, every secret I whispered to myself in the quiet, was being etched onto a spool of magnetic tape, filed away with all the others who had bought this place for a bargain. The cycle wasn't ending. It was simply waiting for the next owner to walk through the front door. David always had a way of justifying his spending, usually by claiming that business expenses were an investment in his future, which was conveniently also our future. I looked at the receipt, then back at the fridge where a magnet held up the overdue bill from the orthodontist. The bitterness was a physical weight in my chest, but I did not scream. I did not throw the receipt at him. Instead, I spent the rest of the week acting like the happiest wife in the world. I cooked his favorite Sunday roast, I ironed his shirts with extra care, and I even listened to his long, rambling stories about how his assistant was a genius who really understood the complexities of the industry. He was so busy congratulating himself on his smooth deception that he didn't notice I had started making quiet changes. I took our joint savings and moved them into an account he didn't know existed, an account that had been dormant since I worked my first job in college. I gathered all the evidence of his reckless spending and had it professionally organized by a solicitor I had consulted in secret. When Sunday arrived, the house smelled like rosemary and garlic. We sat down for dinner, and David seemed almost guilty, constantly checking his phone under the table. He probably thought he was going to break the news to me tonight, perhaps over a glass of wine. He started a speech about how people grow apart and how he wanted to make sure I was taken care of, provided I didn't make things difficult. He spoke with that patronizing tone he used when he thought he was in total control. I listened to him talk for 10 minutes, nodding occasionally, until he finally reached the part where he demanded we sell the house so he could start fresh. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the divorce papers, already signed and notarized, along with a copy of his bank statements highlighting the tennis bracelet and the hundreds of other gifts he had bought for his assistant on our dime. I laid them on the table right next to his gravy boat. I told him that I had already filed for full custody and that the house was now held in a trust for our son, completely out of his reach. The look on his face was worth every cent of the legal fees. He started to stammer, his arrogance collapsing like a house of cards, but I just stood up, took my plate to the kitchen, and started washing the dishes. I told him that if he wanted to start fresh, he was more than welcome to start by finding a hotel room for the night. As I watched him realize that his lifestyle was gone, I realized that the best part of the whole ordeal wasn't the victory. It was the quiet, peaceful silence of a house finally free of his dishonesty. Let me know in the comments which of these 3 stories stayed with you the longest.